58 years ago, I spent my first night outdoors without anyone showing me how, and I got soaked, cold, and humbled inside of 6 hours. Here's a fact that still stops people cold. Right now, if the power went out in most American towns for even 3 days, a good chunk of folks wouldn't know how to boil water clean enough to drink, let alone start a fire without a lighter. That's not a guess. That's just what I've watched happen to 3 generations of visitors who show up at my place thinking a tent and a phone app is preparation. I've lived most of my life without needing a store nearby, and I didn't set out to prove a point. I just never saw the sense in paying for something the land already gives away. My grandfather taught me to read weather and the color of the sky before he taught me to read a book. That kind of knowledge used to pass hand to hand, father to son, neighbor to neighbor, and nobody called it a survival skill. They called it Tuesday. Somewhere along the way, between refrigerators and delivery trucks, we quietly let all of that go. It didn't happen all at once. It happened one convenience at a time. A grocery store here, a municipal water line there, a furnace that lit itself instead of one you fed by hand. Each one of those things was a genuine improvement. I won't pretend otherwise. I've got a wood stove, and I'm not against a warm house. But every convenience we picked up, we set something else down, usually without noticing, and after 2 or 3 generations, the thing we set down just quietly disappeared from what a family passed on. I've built more shelters out of raw material than I could count if you sat me down and asked me to try, and I've slept under most of them in weather that would have sent a smarter man home. 58 years isn't a number I throw around to impress anybody. It's just how long I've been paying attention. Some of what I know came from an old-timer who never wrote a word of it down. Some of it I earned the hard way, shivering through a night I should have planned better. Tonight, I want to hand you the parts that actually matter. We'll start with fire, because fire is the one thing that separates a rough night from a genuine emergency. And it's also the skill I see erode the fastest in people who've grown up with a stove that clicks on by itself. A lighter is a fine tool right up until it's wet, empty, or lost. And then what you're left with is whatever you actually know. Fire used to be something a household kept alive, not something a household started from nothing every single time. That distinction matters more than people realize. The first thing I ever learned about fire is that most people fail before they even strike anything, because they go looking for flame before they've gathered enough of the right material to feed it. Tinder is 90% of the battle. I'm talking about the driest, finest stuff you can find. Shredded bark, dead grass, the inner fluff of certain seed pods, anything that will take a spark and hold it for half a second longer than you think it will. Collect 3 times more tinder than you think you need, because you will burn through it faster than feels reasonable the first few tries. In wet weather, the trick old-timers relied on is fatwood, the resin-soaked heartwood you find in the stump or dead limb of a pine that's been sitting long enough for the sap to concentrate. You shave it into curls with a knife, and even soak through on the outside, the inside lights like a candle because that resin doesn't care about rain. I've started fires in a downpour with nothing but a pocket knife and a rotten pine stump, and the first time I managed it, I understood why my grandfather never once looked worried about weather. If you want to go back further than a lighter, a bow drill will get you there. But I'll tell you plainly, it's a skill that takes real practice before it earns you a flame on demand. You need a spindle, a fireboard, a bearing block, and a bow strung loose enough to spin the spindle fast under pressure. The dust that piles up from the friction is what catches, not the wood itself, and the first coal you ever get will feel like you've pulled something ancient out of thin air. It humbles nearly everyone the first dozen tries. Keeping a fire alive through a cold night without feeding it every 20 minutes is its own quiet skill, one that used to matter to every household before furnaces ran on their own. You bank the coals, cover them with a bed of ash, and set a slow-burning piece of hardwood on top before you sleep, and in the morning you uncover a bed of coals still hot enough to catch new kindling in seconds. It's the same reason old wood stoves were loaded a certain way at night. Nobody wanted to start from nothing at 5 in the morning. Now I'll say this plainly, because it matters more than anything else in this section. Clear the ground down to bare dirt in a wide ring before you build anything. Keep water or dirt within reach the entire time, And never leave a fire that isn't fully out cold to the touch. I've seen dry country turn into disaster from a fire somebody thought was finished. Respecting fire is not the same as fearing it, and every good firekeeper I've ever known treated it with a kind of careful attention that looked almost like affection. Once fire's settled, shelter is the next thing that decides whether a night outdoors is memorable or miserable. And it's a skill that's nearly vanished, because most people's idea of shelter is something they unzip from a bag. Before manufactured tents were common and cheap, a person heading into the woods overnight expected to build what they slept under from whatever the land handed them. That's not a lost art because it's hard. It's lost because nobody's had to use it in 2 generations. And a skill unused long enough starts to feel like folklore instead of knowledge. The lean-to is the first shelter I ever built on my own, and it's still the fastest one I'd put up if weather turned on me without warning. Find a ridgeline, that's a long sturdy branch or a fallen trunk, and prop one end against a standing tree or a forked support, angled against the wind you expect to fight through the night. Then you lay smaller branches against that ridge, like ribs, angled the same direction, close enough together that daylight barely shows through. It's crude the first time you try it, and it gets faster every single time after. The part people skip, and it's the part that actually keeps you alive, is piling debris over that frame thick enough to trap air, not just block wind. Leaves, pine boughs, dead grass, bark slabs, whatever's on the ground in enough volume, stacked until you can't see the ribs of your frame underneath anymore. A foot of loose debris insulates better than most people expect, because it's the trapped air doing the work, the same principle behind a down jacket. I've spent nights in debris shelters warmer than some cabins I've stayed in with a bad draft. Before you build anything, look up, not just around. Dead limbs hanging over a chosen site have a name in the old logging camps. They called them widowmakers, because they come down without warning, especially after wind or rain loosens what's already cracked. I check the canopy above any spot I intend to sleep before I check anything else about the ground. It takes 30 seconds, and it's saved me more than once from setting up right underneath the kind of branch that would have ended the night a lot worse than a little rain. Site selection is half the battle before you cut a single branch. You want ground that slopes slightly so water runs off instead of pooling under you at 3 in the morning, and you want your opening facing away from the prevailing wind, not into it. Old-timers used to read the moss and the lean of nearby trees to judge which direction the weather usually came from before they ever committed to a spot. It's a small habit, checking the land before you build on it, but it's the difference between a dry night and a miserable one. If I know I'm staying more than a night or two, I'll build something closer to an A-frame, using 2 forked supports set upright with a ridge pole laid between them, then the same ribbing and debris technique, but on both sides instead of one. It takes longer, maybe 2 or 3 hours of steady work instead of 40 minutes, but it holds heat better and gives you room to keep a small fire near the open end without smoking yourself out. It's the difference between a shelter for one bad night and a camp you can actually live in. Lashing all of that together without rope from a store is its own small trade, and it's one that ties directly into shelter work, because a frame that's tied, instead of just leaned, holds together through wind that would otherwise shake it apart by morning. Inner bark from certain trees, when stripped in long wet strips and twisted against itself, makes a cordage strong enough to lash a ridgepole solid. It's slow work the first time you try it, your hands cramping before you've got 3 feet of usable cord, but it gets faster with calluses. I remember one October, maybe 12 years into all this, when I got cocky and skipped half these steps, because I figured I knew enough. I built low, skipped the debris depth, and set up on ground that looked flat but pooled water the second the rain picked up at midnight. I spent that night sitting up against a tree instead of sleeping, cold enough to genuinely worry, and I never skipped a step again after that. Every real skill I've got because I paid for the lesson once, sometimes more than once. So if you take one thing from the shelter section, take this order. Pick your site with water drainage and wind in mind, check the canopy for hazards, build your frame low and sturdy before you worry about looks, then bury it in more debris than feels necessary. Every step skipped costs you comfort at best and safety at worst. It's the same order I've followed for decades, and it's the same order I'll follow tonight if I need to, because none of it depends on a battery or a bar of signal. With fire and shelter squared away, the next thing that separates capable from stranded is water, because you can go 3 weeks without food if you have to, but you won't make it 3 days without something to drink, and most people have never once had to think seriously about where their water actually comes from. It used to be common sense to know the nearest reliable spring or creek near your property, the same way you'd know the nearest neighbor. Now most folks couldn't tell you where their tap water originates past a pipe in the wall. Moving water is always a better bet than standing water, and moving water that's cold and clear, coming off higher ground rather than pooling in a low spot, is about as good as you'll find without treatment. Look for green vegetation lower on a slope even in dry conditions, because that's usually a sign of water close to the surface. Animal trails often converge toward water too, a pattern that's been read by people living off the land for longer than we've had maps, let alone the phones that replace them. Once you've found water, treat it before you drink it, no matter how clean it looks, because clear doesn't mean safe. A hard boil for a full minute kills the overwhelming majority of what would make you sick. And that's the method I trust most because it doesn't depend on a filter that can fail, or chemicals that can run out. If you can't boil, a bandana or cloth folded several times will strain out sediment, but it won't strain out what actually makes people ill, so treat that as a last resort, not a solution. Foraging is where I get the most careful with what I tell people, because unlike fire or shelter, a mistake here doesn't just cost you a bad night, it can genuinely hurt you. I'll teach you the identifying habits my grandfather taught me, but I want to be straight with you. Cross-check anything you plan to eat against a proper regional guide or a knowledgeable local before it goes anywhere near your mouth, because plants and fungi vary by region in ways that can fool even people who've been at this a long time. That said, there are habits of observation that serve people well for generations. Wide-growing, common, widely distributed plants, with no strong odor of almonds or bitterness, are generally safer bets than something rare-looking or oddly colored, though that's a starting habit, not a rule you should ever bet your health on. Cattails, for instance, grow in wet ground across most of the country, and offer an edible root and shoot most of the year, and they're distinctive enough in shape that misidentifying them is genuinely difficult, which is part of why old foragers leaned on them so heavily. Beyond plants, procuring food used to mean fish, and small game more than anything foraged, and a simple set line, or a figure-4 trap, was something a kid learned before they learned long division. A set line, just cordage tied off to a bent sapling or a stake along a bank with a baited hook, works while you're doing something else entirely, which was the whole point. Nobody had time to sit and watch a line all day when there was wood to split and a garden to tend. A figure-4 deadfall works on leverage instead of anything mechanical. 3 carved sticks balance a heavy flat rock or log at an angle, baited so that any disturbance collapses the whole structure downward. It takes patience to carve the notches, right? So the trigger holds steady until it's actually disturbed, and I ruined plenty of sticks getting the angle wrong before it clicked. Where legal and appropriate for genuine need, it's a method that's fed people for longer than firearms have existed, using nothing but a knife and a willingness to sit with the failures. Whatever you catch or gather beyond what you'll eat that day used to be preserved on the spot because there was no refrigerator waiting back at the house. Thin strips of meat or fish hung over a low smoky fire for hours rather than a hot one, dry out, and take on enough smoke to keep for weeks without spoiling. The trick is heat low enough that you're drying, not cooking, and smoke steady enough that flies and bacteria alike lose interest. It's slower than a freezer, obviously, but it never once depends on electricity staying on. Preservation isn't only about meat either. Root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips, keep for months in a cool, dark, humid space that doesn't freeze, which is the entire principle behind a root cellar, something nearly every rural home used to have before grocery stores made year-round produce feel normal. I dug mine into a hillside years ago, mostly by hand, and it still holds a steady temperature through summer heat and winter cold alike. No compressor, no motor, nothing that can break down on me. None of what I've described works without a decent knife, and knife work is a skill in its own right that's shrunk down to almost nothing for most people, who these days might use a blade to open a package and nothing else. Learning to baton wood, that's driving your knife through a piece with another stick used like a hammer, safely splits kindling without a hatchet. Learning to feather a stick, carving thin curls without severing them, gives you tinder that catches faster than almost anything else you'll find lying on the ground. Good knife work is about control, not speed, and it's a lesson that took me a couple of stitches to really absorb as a younger man. You always cut away from your body. You keep your offhand behind the blade's path, rather than bracing in front of it, and you respect a sharp edge more than a dull one, because a dull blade is actually the more dangerous of the two. It slips instead of biting cleanly. A well-kept edge does exactly what you tell it to, which is more than you can say for most tools. Before hardware stores, if you needed a tool, you generally made one, and that habit is worth reviving even in a small way. A digging stick, fire hardened at the point by charring it slightly over embers and scraping the char away to expose harder wood underneath, will outlast a cheap trowel by a wide margin. A wooden mallet, a carved spoon, a simple pack frame lashed from saplings. These were things a competent person expected to be able to produce rather than purchase. And there's a particular satisfaction in using a tool that owes nothing to a supply chain. Cordage deserves its own mention, because rope used to be something a household made rather than bought by the spool, and the plant fibers that work best vary by region, but the principle is the same everywhere. You split the fiber down fine, reverse wrap two bundles against each other in opposite twists, so they lock instead of unraveling, and you keep adding fiber as you go until you've got length. It's tedious, genuinely tedious, work best done sitting by a fire in the evening, which is probably exactly when most people used to do it. Tanning a hide is one of those trades that's nearly extinct outside of a small circle of people who still bother, and it deserves more attention than it gets, because a well-tanned hide is warmer, tougher, and more useful than most manufactured fabric for certain jobs. The old brain tanning method uses the animal's own brain matter, worked into the hide after scraping it clean of flesh and fat, because the fat content happens to be almost exactly what's needed to soften the fibers permanently. It sounds strange until you understand the chemistry, and then it just sounds efficient. After the brain mixture works into the hide, you have to physically work the material for hours, stretching and softening it by hand or over a smooth beam, because the moment it dries without that working, it turns stiff as cardboard and you've wasted the whole hide. Smoking it afterward over a low, sustained fire sets the softness permanently, even after it gets wet again later, which is the step most people skip and then wonder why their hide ruined itself the first time it rained. It's a 2 or 3 day process done right, no shortcuts that actually hold. All of these hand skills, the knife work, the cordage, the tanning, they share something in common that I think is the real point underneath all of it. They turn raw material other people would call waste or scrap into something genuinely useful, using nothing but attention and patience. That's a different relationship with the world than buying a replacement, and once you've felt that difference, it's hard to go back to seeing everything as disposable the way convenience culture kind of trains you to. Living without relying on the grid day to day is less about one dramatic skill and more about a dozen small systems working together quietly, the same way a modern house depends on a dozen utilities you never think about until one fails. Water, heat, food storage, light, waste, each one used to have a simple, low-tech answer that a rural family maintained as a matter of routine, not emergency. I want to walk through a few of those, because it's the accumulation of small systems, not one big heroic skill, that actually gets you through a hard season. Heat is the one people worry about most, and rightly so, because cold kills faster and quieter than almost anything else outdoors, or even inside an unheated house. A well-built wood stove, properly vented, heats a small space efficiently enough that a modest wood pile, split and stacked to dry through a full season ahead of time, can carry a household through a real winter. The mistake I see most is people cutting wood too close to when they need it. Green wood doesn't burn clean. It smokes and smolders. and dry, seasoned wood takes the better part of a year to get there. Water storage on a property used to mean a hand-dug well, a cistern collecting rain off a roofline, or a spring box built directly over a natural source to keep it clean and cold. Any one of those, maintained properly, gives a household water access that doesn't depend on a pump running off electricity, which matters more than people think, until the power's out for 4 days in a heat wave and the tap still works, because gravity, not a motor, is doing the job. That kind of quiet redundancy used to just be how a home was built. Light is easy to take for granted until you've genuinely sat in full dark with nothing, which happens to almost nobody anymore because a phone screen is always somewhere nearby. Candles rendered from animal fat, oil lamps burning anything from lard to kerosene, and simple pitch-soaked torches all did the job for centuries, and any one of them is worth knowing how to make even if you never need to rely on it. I keep both on hand, not because I distrust electricity exactly, but because I don't like depending on something I can't personally repair. Beyond the root cellar and the smoke rack I mentioned earlier, fermentation is probably the most underrated preservation method left, almost entirely to hobbyists, now instead of households. Salt and thyme turn cabbage into something that keeps for months without any heat or electricity at all, and the same basic principle preserves a wide range of vegetables if you get the salt ratio right and keep everything submerged under its own liquid. It's a method that predates refrigeration by thousands of years, which tells you something about how reliable it actually is when done correctly. Sanitation isn't a glamorous topic, but it's one that matters enormously and gets skipped in almost every conversation about self-reliance, probably because it's less interesting than fire or a good knife. A properly built outhouse, sited well away and downhill from any water source, with lime or ash added regularly to manage odor and speed breakdown, handled this for generations without a single flush of water. It's not complicated, but it does require thinking ahead about placement, because getting that wrong contaminates the exact water source you worked so hard to secure elsewhere. A garden, kept honestly and worked through a full season, does more for genuine food security than any amount of stockpiling ever could, because it renews itself instead of running out. Root vegetables that store well, beans that dry and keep for a year on the shelf, and hardy greens that tolerate a rough frost were the backbone of what a rural family actually ate through winter, not some romanticized version of it. It's slower than a grocery run and it demands attention across months rather than minutes, but it owes nothing to a supply chain that can break. I built most of what I've just described over decades, not months, and I want to be honest that none of it happened because I planned some grand self-sufficient life from the start. It happened because I kept choosing the harder, slower way when the easier way wasn't available yet, and by the time it was available, I'd already have the skill and see less reason to trade it for a bill I'd owe every month. That's really the whole secret, if there is one. It's not about rejecting convenience so much as never fully forgetting how to live without it. Here's the part I think about the most, and it's the part that ties back to that fact I opened with. When a skill disappears from common practice, it doesn't announce itself leaving. Nobody holds a funeral for knowing how to read weather or bank a coal fire. It just quietly stops getting passed down, generation by generation, until the people who still know it are old, and the people who might have learned it never even knew there was something to ask about. That's a strange kind of loss, invisible right up until the moment you actually need it. The systems that replaced all this old knowledge are genuinely impressive. I'm not knocking them. A modern water treatment plant does more good for more people than any spring box ever could. But those systems are also more fragile in a specific way, because they depend on a long chain of infrastructure, power, transportation, trained personnel, spare parts, all of it working together continuously. A skill you carry in your own hands doesn't have a supply chain. It doesn't go down because a part failed 2 states away. That's the trade nobody explains clearly when convenience gets sold to you. I've watched it happen more than once. A storm knocks out power to a rural county for a week, and the folks who still keep a wood stove, a hand pump, and a pantry stocked from their own garden barely notice beyond the inconvenience. Meanwhile, a family 2 roads over, entirely dependent on the grid for heat, water, and food storage, is driving 40 minutes each way for gas and bottled water within 2 days. It's not a judgment on them. Most people were simply never taught otherwise. But it's a pattern I've watched repeat itself enough times to stop finding it surprising. Cities make this even more pronounced, because density means a disruption affects more people at once with fewer local resources to fall back on. A city apartment doesn't have a wood stove or a root cellar or a garden plot, and it was never designed to. It was designed around the assumption that the systems underneath it would keep functioning. Most of the time they do, and that assumption is usually a safe one. But the further removed daily life gets from any direct connection to how needs actually get met, the less resilient any individual household becomes to a disruption in that chain. None of this is me telling you to abandon your house and move into the woods, and I want to be clear about that, because it's not the message and it's never been the point of what I do out here. It's simpler than that. It's about not being entirely helpless the moment one convenience fails, about having at least a few things you can do with your own 2 hands regardless of what's working or broken around you. Competence isn't a lifestyle choice. It's more like insurance you carry in your body instead of a filing cabinet. A possession can be lost, stolen, broken, or simply left behind when you leave in a hurry, but a skill goes wherever you go, and nobody can repossess what you actually know how to do. That's the piece I try to get across to every person who visits. And it's the piece that keeps me doing this work, instead of just quietly living it out here, without ever explaining it to anybody. Knowledge that gets shared has a way of outliving the person who shared it, which is more than I can say for most of what fills up a garage. I didn't grow up thinking I'd end up explaining any of this on a camera, and honestly the camera still feels a little strange to me most days I set it up. But I've watched enough of what I just described happen to enough families, and I've met enough younger folks who genuinely wanted to learn this and simply never had anybody around who knew it, that it felt worth the strangeness. Somebody taught me most of what I know, and I didn't pay a dime for it beyond my attention. Seemed only right to pass it forward the same way. I hear from people who grew up in cities their whole lives, who tell me they never once built a fire without a match until they were well into adulthood, and I don't say that to embarrass anybody. Plenty of perfectly smart, capable people simply grew up in a world that never required it of them. What strikes me is how quickly it comes back once somebody actually tries it a few times with their own hands. Like the capacity was there the whole time, just dormant, waiting on an actual reason to wake back up. The generation I worry about the most isn't the one that grew up without these skills, it's the one being raised right now without even the awareness that these skills once existed as ordinary knowledge, not a hobby or a niche interest. A kid who's never once lost signal, never once been more than a few minutes from a store, doesn't lack intelligence or grit. They just lack exposure to a version of the world where you sometimes have to solve a problem with only what's in your hands and around you. That exposure is the thing worth protecting. So go back to that fact I opened with, about most people not knowing how to make water safe to drink if the power went out for a few days. That's not really a criticism of anyone. It's just an accurate description of where 3 or 4 generations of convenience have landed us, collectively, without much of a plan for what happens when the convenience temporarily stops. It's not a crisis waiting to happen every day. It's just a gap, quiet and mostly invisible, sitting underneath a lot of otherwise comfortable, capable lives. 58 years hasn't made me an expert on everything, and I still get things wrong out here more often than I'd probably admit on camera. Roots that don't dry right, a shelter that leaks in a wind direction I didn't account for, a knot that doesn't hold. What those years actually gave me is a kind of calm about not knowing everything, because I know how to figure most things out with time and attention, and that calm is worth more to me than any single skill I've described tonight. So here's the question I actually want to leave you with, and it's not rhetorical. I mean it seriously. If every convenience you rely on stopped working tomorrow, not forever, just for a week, how much of your day would you actually know how to fill with your own 2 hands? Not your phone, not a store, not a number to call. Just you, whatever's around you, and whatever you've actually practiced enough times to trust when it counts. I don't think there's a single right answer to that question, and I'm suspicious of anybody who claims there is, because self-reliance isn't a finish line you cross, It's more like a direction you keep walking in a little further each season. Some people will only ever want to know enough to be comfortable on a weekend trip, and that's genuinely fine. That's still more than most. Others will chase it further, the way I did, until it becomes less a skill set and more just how they live. Either way, the direction matters more than the distance. One last thing worth knowing, something my grandfather leaned on more than any forecast. Watch how smoke rises from a fire. Smoke that climbs straight and thin usually means stable, fair weather is coming. Smoke that flattens out low and spreads sideways, even on a calm-looking day, usually means pressure's dropping, and rain or wind is on its way within hours. It's not perfect, nothing in nature is, but it's given me more accurate warning over the years than a few weather apps I've tried, mostly because it's reading the air right where you're actually standing. Every one of these skills, fire, shelter, water, food, tools, the small systems that hold a self-reliant life together, they share the same quiet reward underneath the practical use of them. They give you back a kind of attention to the world that convenience tends to dull, because when you actually need to read the wind, the ground, the smoke, and the season, you start noticing all of it, all the time, whether you need to or not. That noticing, more than any single skill, is what I'd call the real inheritance from the people who taught it to me. So tell me honestly, down in the comments, how would you actually answer that question I asked earlier, about how much of your week you could fill without the conveniences you're used to? And if you grew up learning any of this a different way than I described tonight, a regional trick, a family method, something your own grandparents swore by, I'd genuinely like to hear it, because most of what I know, I learned exactly that way, from somebody willing to say it out loud. Next time, I want to walk through building a proper root cellar from scratch, start to finish, the same way I dug mine years ago, along with a few storage tricks that keep vegetables good clear through to spring. If any of what I've covered tonight is new to you, there's a lot more of it sitting in the rest of what I've filmed out here, and I'd be glad to have you stick around for it. Until then, I'll be out here doing what I've always done, same as the 58 years before it.